In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Saint Bernard,
Pray for us.
welcome to our first class of 2023 for novices, using the rule for perfection. Be you therefore perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. St. Matthew chapter 5, verse 48. And then also, this was not a new teaching of Christ, but a confirmation of something that he had already said in the book of Deuteronomy. Thou shalt be perfect and without spot before the Lord thy God. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 13. The reason why we have to try to become perfect is because God said so. Because the word perfect is used to describe many mundane and unimportant things, the perfect Sunday, the perfect haircut, the perfect afternoon. We should not then think lightly of the term perfect, or think that God is using hyperbole when he commands us to be perfect. To be in a state of perfection in this life must be sought out. It should be viewed by us who are spiritual beginners to be out of our quick reach. It is not a topic that is going to be spoken about at length in homilies. It is something so terrible that if you were to approach even upright and holy people who do good deeds, you probably will at most get a frustrated look and a very quick answer. And it was so hidden by the Desert Fathers that they more or less made you become a pest to them, to even give you a small word towards obtaining perfection, let alone giving you a complete course on perfection at once. St. Bernard makes this remark in regards to, and we're not going to rely extensively on St. Bernard's path to perfection because he writes it over about 8 homilies, but it's all in regards to the idea of the, if you see that painting up on the wall there, how Bernard's embracing Christ. That's based on these homilies, and the beginner starts by kissing the ground beneath the feet of Christ. And he travels up until he's one day invited to kiss his face. And this is what he says about obtaining perfection. The novices, the immature, those but recently converted from a worldly life, do not normally sing this song or hear it sung, speaking about perfection. Only the mind disciplined by persevering study, only the man whose efforts have borne fruit under God's inspiration, the man whose years, as it were, make him ripe for marriage years, measured out not in time, but in merits only, he is truly prepared for nuptial union with the divine partner, a union we shall fully in due course. Hold on a second. I think there's a problem. Nope. So then perfection follows a process. Perfection should be understood as the perfect love of God and the service of our neighbor. What does that mean is that person's basically so inebriated in his thoughts, his mind, his heart, and everything around him on doing everything to please God that he completely forgets himself, and that this is a something that sees through the veil in the sense that they know the perfect will of God because God and them are joined together. The consequence that arises from this is the service of our neighbor. Even the contemplative, the hermit who's in his cave, of course, they pray for the world and for all the members of the church and do penance on behalf of sinners, and they pray for the dead. If we examine the process by which a person grows in the love of God, that of faithful fidelity, exact obedience, complete renunciation, and cheerful sacrifice, we can get an idea about the road that lies in front of us. St. Bonaventure, the Seraphic Doctor, outlines in his work, The Fire of Love, 6 stages of this perfect love that give us an idea how God draws somebody to the perfect love of him. The first one is sweetness of the soul. Every beginner more or less experiences this. You experience this when you have an upright conscience, when you see something in worship or some act of virtue that you delight in. If you've ever heard the saying, right, the reward for goodness is the goodness itself, there's a kind of a touches upon this idea, the sweetness of soul that we experience when we do good things. What follows after this, when we get this sweetness, which is better than any type of pleasure, although it doesn't always start that way. Remember when we're describing these things, these movements, that because men aren't angels, we exist in these 3 domains where there's what we're experiencing interiorly, there's what we're experiencing in the flesh, and then there's what we are experiencing in confusion, which is the soul and the flesh kind of fighting over who's going to have dominion. And you've probably experienced this if you've been still in church, praying well, and you're wrapped up in thinking in God, and then like somebody drops a book and you're knocked out of it, and you've had this agitation in your mind immediately switches back over. And a lot of our life, especially when we're wrapped up in doing work, experiences these fluctuations back and forth, but you can still have sweetness of soul. It doesn't mean it's a perpetual feeling of it. This is followed by yearning of the soul. Yearning of the soul is where we begin to love God so much that things that are earthly no longer satisfy us. And I will say as an aside, and also from my own reading, that it seems that this is where most people don't get beyond in this life. They go between sweetness and yearning, or they lose sweetness altogether, and then they just kind of struggle to keep their head above water. We all reach the conclusion soon enough that spiritual things and serving God oftentimes come at the expense of many other things. And we begin to see that life is a series of choices. And as such, we begin to feel an interior repugnance to earthly things. For example, entertainments, travel, certain forms of humor or what have you. But we are always eager to get back to our goal, which is to fill our hearts with God in those things that bring about the memory of God in us. Now, it is possible, of course, for these things to kind of intersect. So a person can, for example, use something like music, where that increases their distaste of the earth and fills their heart with love of God. But it normally still comes at the expense. Like there's certain music that moves it to the love of God, and there's certain music that makes it forget God. And it begins to feel a repugnance against the music that makes it forget God. The third stage is satiety of the soul. And this is when the soul begins to despise things. It doesn't just dislike them and feel repugnance towards them, but it begins to despise things. And this is an activity of God within the soul where it basically not only does it dislike worldly things, but it feels a pain when it's forced to deal in them. In the lives of the saints, we see them experience this where they're so eager to run off to the monastery, run off to a hermitage, or go about their charitable works, that it causes them pain to then deal with certain mundane things. The next stage is inebriation of the soul. And this is where everything above is happening, but in addition to that, the soul begins to desire to suffer for God. This is not a small desire to suffer for God, but it is a constant desire to prove oneself's merits before God by suffering for him. Now, this has to be viewed in light of providence. So a person who's not living in a country with explicit political persecution might, for example, love the illnesses that they suffer, or they might love the burdens that they feel from a material poverty. The next is security of soul. All of this exists, but it is something now that has been proven by prayer, and the soul feels a deep conviction that God will help it bear all of its sufferings and bring it through all trials. It's not a reckless testing of God, but it's an experiential knowledge that arises from many prayers being answered. And so the soul has the right disposition towards God. Basically, it has a faith that knows whatever it asks for in prayer, it will receive. And if it doesn't receive it, then it's good for its salvation. And the highest is perfect tranquility of soul. Nothing disturbs the soul at all. It will suffer whatever it must suffer. It will live if it must live. It will die if God wills it. We can think of course, Christ in the garden with his let this pass from me, but thy will be done. We can think of Saint Martin of Tours when he was dying. The people were weeping around him, and he said, Lord, basically, if you wish for me to live, then I wish to live. If you wish for me to die, then I wish to die. Those were his last words. So he had perfect tranquility of the soul. Perfection harmonizes all duties. So our rule, which is our rule of perfection, which the Church has given us as an aid to seeking perfection, bestows upon us certain duties and certain obligations. It also proposes a certain form of examination that must be done of ourselves to see if we are truly obedient. And you can read the rule in a bad way, where you, upon reading a section like, do not speak light and silly words, or that your Friday meal needs to be penitential, and view it to come to odds with your duties to your family, church and civil society, and so forth. That's the wrong way to read the rule. The right way to read the rule is in light of all of our duties, and to know that every part of the rule can be lived in harmony with all the other duties that we have. So if we think there's some way of reading it where we go, this isn't going to work with this, you're wrong. That does not mean that there are not going to be tensions that arise from the rule with competing duties. And this is why the word duty is so important. Duties are not desires. It is seldom ever a man's duty, for example, to be a Little League coach. Being a Little League coach when you have to be in the evenings at church at Vespers would create a conflict. A knight has a real duty to be at church for Vespers if it's possible, if he's not working. So if these two things were to appear to be competing duties, they are not. One is a true duty, one is a pleasure. That doesn't mean that he neglects his children. It just means that he doesn't do that other thing, and he finds another way to fulfill his duty as a father to bring his children up in virtue. If a person, when trying to conform themselves to the rule, is unsure of how to keep the rule perfectly, then they should ask counsel from their director or novice master. It's also important when we read the rule that we don't engage in any type of critical reevaluation. And this is something that, unfortunately, some people can be easily given over to. Our rule is never meant to be read outside of the context of the Catholic religion. So, for example, the terminology that we use in the rule is meant to be a Catholic terminology. It is not meant to be the type of terminology you can necessarily get from Merriam-Webster's dictionary. So when we mean something a certain way, it's in light of our moral and ascetical teaching, not in light of what maybe civil or normal society thinks. The rule itself, that is the rule we keep, is already an adaptation of a medieval rule, and it's already been modernized. So we never need to furtherly modernize it, nor do we need to mitigate it any more than it's already been mitigated. We should reflect regularly on the fact that St. Bernard, I'm doing terrible with my PowerPoint, that St. Bernard wrote the primitive Latin rule, which ours rule is from, and he had great holiness and learning. And that the original aim and purpose of the rule was to aid in the salvation of those who bind themselves to it, and to also provide a lifestyle for a functioning brotherhood. If you're reading the rule and that you find that there's some passage in it that you find is not clear, it's hard to understand, try to read it in relation to the other parts of the rule that are understandable. And see if you have something that you feel is too radical, read it in light of the actual explicit obligations that are laid down and ask yourself, does a rule that binds so strictly but not so burdensomely here, is it demanding an action that is utterly heroic or greatly heroic? So how should we use the rule in the pursuit of perfection? First, by reading it. I mean, just sitting down and reading it. We can look for two types of passages in the rule when we read it. The first is to inflame love and zeal for God. We can think of those lines like, those he has taken out from among sinners to serve him, to speak about our own personal relationship with God. I've always found the line, prefer nothing to the love of Christ, to stir up my zeal for God at renouncing things, or when I'm struggling in temptation over some excess. And then to mourn over sins. We should not try to back away from those sections of the rules that cause us pain when we see that the conduct of our lives are in opposition to it. Rather, we should dwell on those a long time and mourn before God. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. If we cannot see a way that we can quickly overcome this fault or this habitual neglect of this part of the rule, then we can at least start bringing it regularly to mind, and we do that by reading it again and mourning over our negligence. We should remember, though, that a habitual, deliberate negligence rising to the level of a scandal because of contempt can actually make us fall into mortal sin. There are very few ways to fall into mortal sin in the rule outside of actually committing a mortal sin and then the rule being against that sin too. So you already have a mortal sin, right? With or without the rule. But to habitually and with contempt and scandal break a part of the rule would be to fall into it. The second is by using the rule as a guide for examination to prepare oneself for confession, especially chapter 4 of the rule. Because it goes over so many different dispositions of soul, especially concerning thoughts, attitudes, and tastes, reading parts of the rule to prepare us for confession can be more helpful than even going through a standard examination of conscience guide. Identifying those areas in our lives where we do not deny ourselves or are too light with all of our senses which the rule directs us to. We can remind ourselves too that because we are binding ourselves to the rule, that whenever we keep the rule, we are practicing both the virtue of religion and piety because we've done something extra for God that we've bound ourselves to, and also honesty. I meant to mention one more thing on mourning over the sins. It is important for us to remember that we are going to mourn over our faults before the rule constantly, and that if we actually read the rule and we find that we're perfect in everything, that we're most certainly not perfect in everything, because there are certain sections of the rule that there is an impossibility in this life to reach the heights of. Denying oneself completely to follow Christ is not something that you can obtain in this life in its fullness until you're dead. Like, life is one continual act of self-denial. And it's important to remember that the publican who wouldn't lift his eyes to heaven, he went home justified, while the Pharisee who did not see fault in himself did not. So if the rule makes us feel small and beaten down and humble, then that actually you're experiencing movements of God's grace. It's if it makes us feel inebriated and full of ourselves, that we are better than other men because we keep rules, then we're most assuredly experiencing the Pharisee's prayer. Okay. As we examine ourselves, especially against the various counsels of the rule, it can be very helpful to identify our predominant faults and then be able to repent of them. 3 is to study the rule. If we were to take one line of the rule and try to understand the excerpt with a Catholic understanding by examining works that expound upon the verse. I'll give you a concrete example. St. Bernard explicitly outlines in his work On Consideration what is meant by do not speak light and silly words. He actually quotes that line by line in his exposition to Pope Eugenius II. We can then understand it with the mind of St. Bernard by looking at it, and that is our preferred person to look at, and what the meaning of the verse is. What does the teacher say what light and silly words are? We can also try to identify terms and look for definitions from proper sources of a dogmatic, moral, or ascetical theology. For example, we can take something like obey the master, which seems clear, but if you do not know that obedience to a superior in an order only pertains to those things written down in the rule and the constitutions, I don't have the right to tell somebody to go home and drink orange juice. I don't. And people who were to take something like religious obedience and turn it into some type of odd robotic command thing, abuse it and have injured it to the point that people do not want to take on, we harm the idea of holy obedience by giving a wrong definition of it. So we want to identify terms and look for definitions or ask for them. We should also consider, now we're studying, we're sitting down, we're looking at just one line, we're looking for sources, We can also just consider it. How does this apply to my life? This rule was written in modern times. There's got to be a way to live it out in a modern context. I may not have, for example, the ability to give my leftovers to my poor widow neighbor because I live in a nice neighborhood where everybody can feed themselves. Do I have some means, though, of clearing out my pantry of things before they go bad? Do I keep some manner of giving alms when I come to and from the grocery market? So on and so forth. Does it involve any changes of persons or places to keep this part of the rule? And then also, is the way I'm living out the rule right now a good way? Understood as a way where I am trying very hard to keep the commandments of God in the spirit of the nights, but I still, I ask myself, am I within the boundaries of morally acceptable conduct? That's the good way. Or the better way. I'm within the bounds of morally acceptable conduct, but this is not to my tastes, likes, or inclinations. It fights against it, right? I'm doing something. I'm trying to bend the bent fork back into place in my living a life of penance. Or the best way, which is, am I trying to do the thing that redeems the best way is more or less the way that causes you the most blood and sweat to the highest benefit of God's glory and your neighbor. And then finally, if I make a change to my life because of this section of the rule, will something else go out of harmony with a duty towards somebody else or some other thing? If we find that some radical change will make something come out of harmony, or it might come into tension, it's best to ask counsel before doing so, once again, of a novice master or a director. As a rule of thumb, if it deals with some type of personal sin, like in your past, or it's a question of sin, it's better generally to go to your director. If it's a question of outward conduct or the tensions that arise in lay life, it's better to go to your novice master. And of course, they can send each other back and forth. And then finally, resolve. Saying passages of the rule when trying to make small decisions in your life. I am not supposed to eat to satiety. Deny yourself completely. Always to show kindness to the sick and elderly brothers. And then finally, constantly going over sections of the rule in your mind to avoid dissipation of spirit. We don't want to embrace the blah, especially when we're forced to be in places or at times where they're not the most edifying experiences, whether this is a work meeting or we're at some entertainment for our family or what have you. And a good example of this would be Blessed Carl used to, when he was after he had abdicated his throne and was in Switzerland, I believe, he'd take the kids out to see the fireworks, but he wouldn't look at them. He'd keep his eyes down towards the ground or something. Well, we can, as a means to sacrifice, we can also go into our minds and we can repeat the rule to keep our resolve always up to live perfectly, or to try to live perfectly, even if we have to be watching the fireworks for whatever reason. It is important to look at this last section of the rule in chapter 20, where it says, "We order forever that everyone respect this rule in every part, even in respect to what may be unjustly taken from you." Respecting the rule is to respect the entire order, and to disrespect it is to disrespect the entire order. Respect does not mean that you perfectly keep the rule, though you should strive to. What it means is that you hold something holy in the proper reverence. And just as a man constantly looks at his conduct to make sure that he is not breaking the Ten Commandments, he's not offending his neighbor, so should we also constantly glance a respectful look at the rule at some regular interval in regards to the way which we live out our lifestyle. And then finally, in regards to the idea of things being unjustly taken from you, this speaks to the reality of any association, the reality of any brotherhood, is that in every relationship, there's going to be moments where we let each other down. And if even what's only taken from us is a little bit of our joy or what have you, we still are bound to the rule and to respect it and its outward conduct towards one another at all time. Even if a superior makes a decision that we do not like, or some exterior thing greatly irritates us. I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions about the presentation. If you're on the chat, please go ahead and type in any questions you might have. Not even one for good measure, huh? No? Okay. Does everybody agree with St. Bonaventure? Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, it was a good talk.
Okay. You just making sure the audio is working on the presentation?
Yeah, it's just curious.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead then and end the stream.